Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. In today's tutorial I'm going to show you how I painted this realistic and colourful looking tangerine in my sketchbook using my watercolours and just 2 tubes of gouache. I'll also share my process for picking colours for this one, as it's a bit different to my usual method. So I hope you enjoy the video and maybe get inspired to try mixing these two mediums together in your own artwork. All the materials I'll be using will be listed in the description box below, along with the reference photo from Pixabay. Now normally before I start any drawing or painting, I'll spend a bit of time studying my reference photo and swatching out my colours based purely on what I can see with my own eyes. But this time I decided to try out the eyedropper tool on my computer, and I've printed off what I found. By doing this, I hope to make my painting a bit more visually interesting and maybe learn a thing or two as well. And it was actually quite fun to see what colours the eyedropper picked up versus what I saw just by eyeballing it. So with this done, I began my painting and started by painting the first layer on the oranges using my watercolours. This is Winsor & Newton's cadmium orange, and I applied it onto wet paper. Whilst the paper was wet, I also dropped in some of Winsor & Newton's transparent orange to the lower half of the fruit. And using the information from the exercise with the eyedropper tool, I added in some of Daniel Smith's Pyrrole Scarlet too. I'm still painting wet on wet to get nice smooth colour mixing, and I use a damp brush around any paint edges to prevent any hard edges from forming. I continued with the wet on wet technique and used these same 3 colours to paint the area of skin underneath the segments. But instead of relying on my own judgment and painting more orange and brown shades, I went in with more of the Pyrrole Scarlet shade, which really helped to keep the painting bright and vibrant. And I was excited to see what differences my colour choices would make to other areas of the painting too. So when it came to painting the segments themselves, as well as dropping in some of the cadmium orange, I also added some watery Winsor red to give more of a pinky hue to areas that at first glance appeared orange. And with the paper still damp, I began to build up this first layer by adding more concentrated cadmium orange and transparent orange, and started to suggest at some of the shapes within the segment. There were also some blue and violet shades in the brightest part of the segment, but to avoid any muddying of my colours, I waited for the first layer to dry completely before adding in a bit of ultramarine blue mixed with a bit of the Winsor red. Now to paint another layer on the tangerines in the back. I left the highlights on the top of each tangerine white, but on closer inspection and by going back to the reference image on my computer, these areas aren't white at all. It's funny how our eyes can play tricks on us, but sometimes if you look at a reference photo as a whole, the colours appear differently because of the other colours surrounding it. So for example, you might see the highlights on the orange as white, but actually when isolated they are more pale pink or rose. So I applied a watery mix of shell pink onto the dry paper and softened out any hard edges with a clean damp brush. This is a Mission Gold watercolour. That's all dry now, so I can start to work on building up my colours and values with another layer. I used the same colours as before and also swatch out some burnt sienna and Indian red. There are a couple of techniques you can use to add this and subsequent layers, so you can re-wet the whole area again and add paint to get smooth colour mixes like I'm doing here, or you can add your watercolour onto dry paper in the form of a glaze and soften out any edges with a clean damp brush, like I'm doing on this second tangerine. I like using both methods, but I tend to use the wet in wet technique more for larger areas and the wet on dry or glazing method for smaller areas where I want more control. After I'd painted the green stalks on each fruit, I then switched down to a smaller size 4 brush to paint in more detail to the segments, and for this I painted onto dry paper as I wanted more definition here. I didn't paint them exactly as the reference photo, but I did look at the type of shapes that I could see and the size and direction of the separations. They tended to radiate out from the centre, so I did my best to replicate that in my painting without worrying about it being too exact. On this segment I used more pinky red tones and tried to leave spaces between the juicy parts to allow the lighter colours to show through. I also added some Windsor Violet here just to add interest and tie in with the foreground that I wanted to change from the reference photo. Then it was just a case of building up the colours and values by adding further layers and glazes. Being able to add multiple transparent layers while still maintaining a bright luminosity to your paintings is what makes watercolour so unique, and is why I enjoy it so much. It does require a certain amount of patience though, as this layering process can take time, and requires you to continually reassess your piece as a whole as it starts to take shape. Here I'm glazing over some more transparent orange onto the dry paper. But watercolour tends to dry lighter, so once this layer was dry I decided to add yet another layer, this time of watery Indian red. I painted this onto pre-wet paper as Indian red is an opaque watercolour and I wanted the colours to shine through from underneath. So by painting it onto wet paper it further diluted the paint. So it still gave me a slight change of colour that I wanted without covering up any of the underneath layers that I'd already painted in. Whilst the paper was damp, I also dropped in some more of the Pyrrole Scarlet. I repeated this on the other tangerine, adding more of the Indian red, and I also added to this mixture a small amount of Windsor Violet, and just darkened up the shadow at the bottom of the tangerine too. Now before I go in with the gouache and talk a bit more about that, I'm just going to paint in the foreground. I wanted to keep this quite light and simple and decided to go with Windsor Violet just because I thought it would go well next to the yellows, orange and red tones in the tangerine. Okay, so for the next part of the painting I'm going to be using gouache, which is an opaque watercolour. I have Winsor & Newton's designer gouache here in permanent white and raw sienna, and rather than just using the white on its own, I'll be mixing it in with my watercolours to create some soft pastel highlights. First though, I'm using the raw sienna to paint in the background. Gouache dries with an even matte finish, and I thought this would complement the watercolour nicely to give a slightly different look and feel to the piece as a whole. I added just enough water to help it flow across the surface of the paper, and applied it with a flat brush. You can add as much or as little water as you like, and even use it more like watercolour if you want, but unlike watercolour, gouache tends to dry darker, so that's just something to bear in mind. I wanted to have a solid matte background here, so I didn't add much water, and being opaque, I was able to paint this background in just one layer. You can add another layer if needs be, but you need to be careful not to add too much water, or else you could reactivate the gouache underneath. To avoid this, you can use acrylic gouache, which dries permanently, but it's more expensive than regular gouache and I haven't tried it yet. So let me know in the comments if you've tried acrylic gouache and if you would recommend it. Next, I want to brighten up some of the highlights, and for this I'm going to use the permanent white gouache. But like I said before, the highlight areas aren't pure white. So I mixed in some of my Winsor red watercolour to create an opaque pink colour. I applied this using a dry size 1 flat brush and used a stippling or tapping motion onto the paper. It looks like a really subtle tint on my palette, but remember that gouache dries darker, and I think it's a great and easy way to change up your highlights without having to go out and buy a whole range of different coloured gouache. I mixed in a tiny bit of Winsor violet watercolour with the gouache too, to brighten up the lighter part of the segments, and used a very dry brush and a sweeping motion to add in a bit of texture. Only then did I go in and add some neat white gouache, and this was just to the very edges of the segments, and to a few spots on top of the tangerines as well. And I think it worked out quite well. But to add some finishing touches to the skin of the tangerines, I decided to go in with some coloured pencil. This is a Prismacolor pencil in the shade Crimson Lake. I added a few dots of this in places to suggest the pitted texture of the fruit, and then used the side of the pencil to darken up the shadows. And being that this is cold pressed paper and has a bit of texture to it, the pencil naturally skipped over the little valleys in the paper, creating a more textured look to the skin with hardly any effort at all. And with that, this painting was complete. It was really interesting playing around with the eyedropper tool and mixing gouache and watercolour together in this painting, and I would definitely recommend trying it out for yourself if you get the chance. But you don't need to rush out and buy a whole set of gouache paints, as you really only need white for adding tints and maybe the 3 primary colours to mix more saturated colours. Let me know in the comments if you've mixed watercolour and gouache together before, and please, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe and hit the bell to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching, take care, have a great week, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!